£10.9 billion were lost in fraud and error in the government's programmes to support businesses during the COVID pandemic. That's the finding of the COVID Fraud Commissioner, who was appointed by the Chancellor Rachel Reeves. What were the scams? And does the government have any chance of getting that money back? We'll discuss on this latest episode of the BBC's daily news podcast, Newscast. Hello, it's Adam in the Newscast studio. £10.9 billion. That is how much was lost in fraud and error as part of the COVID financial support schemes that were put in place to help businesses, employers, companies, you name it. And this is the finding of the COVID Fraud Commissioner, Tom Hayhoe, who was appointed by Rachel Reeves, making good on her pledge during the election campaign. The number is the big thing, 10.9 billion. The other big thing is the fact that this investigation has found that much of that is not going to be recovered. It is gone for good. So what's in this report? Why does it matter? The person who can tell us is the BBC business editor, Simon Jack, who's here. Hi, Simon.
Hello, Adam.
Right. Take us through some of the findings then of this big investigation.
OK, so it found out that there was £10.9 billion of fraud or error detected in the various COVID support schemes. Now, to put that in context, that is just a little bit less than we spend on the entire Justice Department in any given year, on all our courts, all our prisons, etc. So it's a very big number. Of that 10.9 billion, 1.8 billion has so far been recovered. But one of the top lines, I think, from it is the bulk of the rest of it is likely beyond recovery. So we're not going to get this money back, or even though the report does recommend that some departments keep going after it.
Which is a bit of a reality check, because during the election, Rachel Reeves was trumpeting that she was going to set up this commission and that actually then the government would be able to get claw loads of money back. But actually, this is just a sort of revealing the size of the problem exercise rather than a money-making scheme.
Yeah, and a lot of it, I think, I think it's pretty fair to say a lot of it is beyond recovery. Now, there are lots of different bits to this. One of the things that had a very high profile are things like, PPE overspend, spending money on faulty things, or that's had a very high profile. But that's only 500 million of this total. 1.7 billion on loans that were taken out by businesses of all sizes, sometimes fraudulently, maybe a business that had been dormant and wasn't really operating, so they take some money for that. But the biggest chunk by far, 5 billion of the 10.9, is actually through the various furlough schemes, both for employees and for the self-employed. That was a very big scheme, £90 billion, and 5 billion of that, I think, is fraud or error. And that is things like employers taking the money for the furlough scheme, but then asking their employees to come to work anyway.
Right.
So getting their workers for free, basically. Or, for example, inflating the number of hours they were doing to maximise their recoveries. So that's the biggest thing. So this thing about dishing money out to cronies that Rachel Reeves was saying misses, I think, the main point of this, which is that a lot of it went through the furlough scheme.
And it's a reminder that lots of these schemes were very, very light touch as far as spending government money normally goes.
They were rolled out at enormous speed. The design and the delivery of them was in days. Usually it would take months to do something like this. And I remember saying at the time, I wasn't the only one, saying, gosh, they're going to rolling this out so quickly. This has got to be vulnerable to fraud. And so it, in fact, has transpired. And I remember talking to the Treasury about this. This is going to be abused, right? And they said, we know. But speed is of the essence. And what we don't have in this report, really, although it does acknowledge this, is what the counterfactual might have been, which is that, I speak to businesses all the time that says, without my COVID loan, without the furlough scheme, I wouldn't be here today. And that would have had a devastating impact on the economy. So yes, a big number, but an acknowledgement that it was rolled out at speed and that, we don't know what we would have lost had we not done it. And there are some recommendations in there, which is that fraud prevention was not sufficiently embedded in the various civil service thinking at the time it was designed, and there's better data needed and better cooperation between departments because there's a breakdown across departments.
Also, one of the scams that it highlights is businesses applying for the loans and then winding themselves up so that they never have to pay them back. But it sounds like they've had some success of preventing the businesses winding themselves up.
Yes, but although it must be said that the recovery rate on the bounce back loans of various sizes is actually pretty low. low. Of the 1.7 billion they identified in fraud, something like 70 million they've recovered to date. So I'd say the recovery rate on that is actually not as impressive as it is elsewhere. But, as I say, when you turn on a tap and say, here's free money, there'll be some mouths around that tap which will basically see an opportunity there. Basically, it's a recommendation for what can we do next time. Gosh, one hopes there isn't a next time. Worth remembering the scale of this, 200 and something billion in these various schemes. 10 billion and 10.9 billion in fraud.
Yeah, because wasn't the total cost, and I'm using air quotes because it's really hard to work out, of COVID, something like 350 billion?
Yes.
This is 10 billion out of 350 billion.
Exactly. So, is that a price you're prepared to pay for an emergency response? Maybe it is. Clearly, there are lessons to be learned.
Or maybe at the time it is, but afterwards it isn't.
Yeah, okay, right. At the time, it's just like, get the money out the door. And I raised it with the Treasury, and they said, listen, we know this is going to happen, but speed is of the essence. And like many things were done in a hurry. Things done in haste, you repent at leisure.
And also, Simon, I just remember back in the day, the immense amount of pressure the government was under every day to, introduce this scheme, or, there's this area of the economy that you've not looked after, introduce something now. Yeah. People were really, really hammering them.
And quite a lot of people angry that certain people weren't helped out at the time. You'll remember the excluded people who were the self-employed, who didn't pay themselves a salary, for example, but they paid themselves out of dividends. I basically take any money that's left after I've paid all my bills and I take it in the form of dividends. That wasn't covered. And a couple of million of those people will say they didn't get any help at all. So there's a bit of, you can take from this whatever you want, to be honest. But as I say, 10.9 billion is a very big number.
Also, what I think is so intriguing in the Treasury press release explaining all of this, the equivalent they give for what this 10 billion could buy you, and it's free school meals for every child for 8 years. Yeah, or every child that's eligible for free school meals. It's like just
more than a penny. It's more than a penny off income tax if you did it in any 1 year. So there we go.
I just think that's a very sort of loaded example that the Treasury.
Well, the lifting of the 2-child benefit cap was 3.5 billion, so it's 3 times that for a start.
I have to say, though, the pressure on Rachel Reeves last week seems to have sort of dissipated this week when we talk about the budget. Well,
you'd be better placed to discuss that than I would be. But certainly the noises, the caravan has moved on a little bit. I think what I speak to people in the business world is saying that, we just want to get on with our lives for the most part. Yes, there was a drum beat and roll up to this, and it was a bit confusing, and there was a bit of head fake. And you've got Mel Stride still pressing the idea that there was a false market in government bonds. He wants the FCA to investigate that, saying that she wasn't telling, she was dealt 2 cards in the pocket. If you're a fan of Texas Hold'em poker, you get 2.
Or the Beyonce song of the same name.
Okay, you get 2 cards dealt down that no one else can see, and then you share the other cards. She was dealt 1 card which was a bit of an ace, saying that tax receipts were going to be much higher than expected, and 1 card which was a 2 of diamonds or something, which was that productivity was much lower. She chose to play the 2 of diamonds and didn't tell us about the ace up her sleeve.
Do you know what, Simon? I'm going to give you the newly inaugurated prize for the best metaphor for explaining the fiscal position ahead of the budget, because many people have tried and few have done it as well as you. And just before you go, do you have any thoughts on the whole battle for Warner Brothers?
I do.
It's Netflix and Paramount going for it.
Well, it's so interesting. This story's got it all, hasn't it? It's a sexy takeover battle. It's about something that we all know and most of us love, which is the various streaming services. You've got 2 interesting things here. One is competition in Hollywood. So if you had put Paramount and Warner together they would rival Disney for number 1 slot. The big 5 would become the big 4. So there's that. But Hollywood doesn't mind that because that's a beast they understand. And then you've got the other one, which is putting together Warner with Netflix, and you have this huge streaming behemoth, which Hollywood doesn't like because they think that's going to swallow up cinema. It's the end of cinema as we know it. Both of them have their problems, their competition issues. I have to say, the one that probably poses the most competition issues is the Netflix Warner tie-up, but the Paramount one is not without its issues. And you've got Donald Trump seeming to, sort of shoot holes in one, and now he's shooting holes in the other one as well. And you've got the involvement of some of the Trump family. It's, as I say, it's got. I have to say, I don't think there's a 0 chance that this deal doesn't get done because of the issues with both.
Sorry, there's too many negatives in that sentence.
Okay,
say again. You did such a good metaphor for the budget.
I think because there are problems with both of them, I don't think there's a 0 chance that the deal doesn't get done. So it might not happen.
Right.
But at the moment, the markets, which I'm being a boring wonk like this, monitor, most people think that Paramount have done enough to win this race. Their shares were up 9% the other day. Netflix were down. But what's interesting is that basically their shares are responding. Whoever gets the deal done, people think that's good for them. And obviously there's the consumer angle on this as all. Does this mean, I know a lot of people have asked me, well, I've got a Netflix account. Does that mean if they buy Paramount, if they buy Warner's, that means because they cover cricket and rugby and all that stuff, I'll get a sports subscription thrown in. I think the worry there is that when you have concentration of power, the temptation for the dominant players is to start turning the dial up in terms of how much you pay.
Well, yeah, because I wonder if phase 2 of this story, after the whole takeover battle, will then be is it anti-competitive in the streaming market?
Right.
And actually, Netflix can just jack their prices up because they're so good compared to everyone else in terms of the amount of content they've got, and then it means we as consumers suffer in the streaming market.
I think they'll be keen to downplay those dangers,
sure.
But also I think a very easy argument for them to make, saying, well, we've got all this extra content now, and maybe you should pay a little bit more for it. So there's the consumer angle to it as well.
And also, I then just think phase 3 will then be when this starts happening in the UK to our companies that we know much and feel much closer to us.
Well, it's interesting because obviously with streaming, if you go through your bank statement, there's all these services which suddenly appear on your bank statement which didn't appear 10 years ago. There's all these digital services, and there's amazing land grab. Everyone competing with each other: Netflix, HBO, blah blah blah, Paramount, Disney, etc. A massive land grab for our eyeballs and our attention and our subscription money. And at the end of one of those land grabs, it is quite normal for there to be some sort of consolidations after a period of that. I think you're beginning to see that. Other people are saying, look, this is actually a really defensive move. Maybe we've hit peak streaming revenue, and that people are getting together because they want safety in numbers and in size, because there's going to be a more rational market on that. Someone also, Matthew Lynn in the Telegraph today, I thought was an interesting article. He said whenever Time Warner as was gets involved, sometimes it signals the top of a stock market. He's saying, could you remember the AOL, America Online, Time Warner thing? That was seen as the biggest, terrible, worst merger of all time, and actually ushered in the dot-com bust. So I'm not saying the stock market's going to crash, but some people are.
Interesting. Simon, thank you.
Thank you, Adam.
Now we know who will be playing who when in the first stages of the World Cup, which is going to be held in North America next summer. It's going to be spread across Canada, Mexico, and the USA. And we would like you to help with our coverage. We're looking for a consumer of this podcast from each of the 48 countries who have made it to the World Cup. So let us know if you would like to be the representative from insert name of country here. You can email us newscast@bbc.co.uk, or you can WhatsApp us on +44 330 123 9480. And we look forward to hearing your pitches to be the representative for the countries that will be on the pitch in the World Cup in the summer. We've had an update on the inquiry into poor standards of care in maternity units in England, which has been carried out by Baroness Amos, the former diplomat and former New Labour minister, which was commissioned earlier this year by the Health Secretary, Wes Streeting. Baroness Amos is not billing this as a sort of interim report, but just her reflections on what her thoughts are so far. And her main thought so far is that she's surprised at how many examples of bad care there have been for mums and dads. And many mothers and fathers are saying they're surprised that she's surprised at all. So let's dig in a bit more into what she's been saying today, because we're joined here in the Newscast studio by someone who spent a lot of time looking at some of the really terrible cases that have hit the headlines in the last few years. It's the BBC Social Affairs correspondent, Michael Buchanan. Hello, Michael.
How you doing?
And welcome back to Newscast, Suzanne White, who's a partner at the law firm Lee Day, who specialises in lots of these cases. Hello, Suzanne.
Hello, Adam. Hi, Michael.
So lots of fanfare when this review was set up because the Health Secretary had come under a lot of pressure to do it. Michael, why is Baroness Amos saying something now? Why isn't she just waiting until her report is done and then we can all read it?
If you take a step back, the whole thing should have been completed by now. It's been delayed, so this is now the interim, and the full report will come out in the spring. And she was always due to give this interim report. This is not a report. She's called it her reflections and interim findings. And essentially what she has been doing is giving us an update on what she has found over 3 months of doing the inquiry. She's spoken to, I think, over a couple of hundred families, 7 NHS trusts, and she's basically amalgamating what she has found, and some consistent themes have emerged. Lots of them people will have heard before: women not being listened to, including when fetal heart movements are reduced and they're saying there's something wrong and medics just ignoring them. Poor and black and Asian women getting worse care than white women. The NHS marking its own homework when things go wrong, women feeling blamed when their baby dies, and then NHS trusts simply not taking appropriate action when their own staff are found to have erred.
Suzanne, I'm guessing, with somebody with the immense experience you've had, none of this is new to you.
None of it is new. I think we welcome any engagement in trying to improve things, and the themes are very well, played out, and all the inquiries before. I think I was just looking at the bullet points today, and obviously it's only out quite recently, but there's nothing really about midwifery culture, and for me that's a big issue. The culture of normal birth and the way that midwives drive women to, without choice and consent, I think, concerns me that they, when they want to have potentially a section, that is not listened to. So I think the midwifery culture and training needs a bit more emphasis from my perspective. But yeah, the themes are pretty much the same. And I do agree, Michael, that she's got a lot to do in a very short period of time in 2026. Yeah.
And Michael, you've been chatting to Baroness Amos. Let's hear some of that conversation now.
So there have been any number of reviews in the last 10 years. In fact, 748 recommendations have been made in relation to maternity and neonatal care. I knew it would be challenging. I knew it would be difficult. What I'm shocked by are the constant experiences I'm hearing up and down the country of the trauma women and families have gone through. The lack of basic care that people talk about, the lack of empathy, the fact that the kind of information and communication that they are looking for is not there, and of course, tragically, the long-term consequences of bereavement and harm. It is costing the families, it is costing communities, it is costing us as a wider society in terms of people's ability to stay in employment, in terms of the mental health impact, and of course, what happens to families, what happens to marriages, what happens to relationships. We need to stop this, and we need to stop it urgently.
So, Michael, that's her talking about the consequences on the people who've had bad experiences, which was one of the big themes of her reflections as she described them. The other big theme is her surprise at why nothing changes, because we've been, as a society, talking about this for a long time. What does she have to say about that?
Well, I asked her that question directly. Why should anybody believe that your review will lead to changes in a way that all the other reviews that haven't? And her answer is because of the commitment of Wes Streeting. She says he is absolutely personally committed to improving maternity care. She points out to this task force that he is going to establish in the new year and that he will chair, and that he has already said that whatever she recommends in the spring for her national recommendations for England, that this task force will implement it. No ifs, no buts. So that's the commitment she is giving. There is a huge amount of scepticism as to whether that will happen, whether the recommendations that she comes forward with will be achievable. But fundamentally, and this is a controversial review because lots of people think that there were other ways of doing this, fundamentally the question that she, and perhaps more pertinently Wes Streeting, will have to answer is in 2028, 2029, is maternity care in England noticeably better than it is at the moment?
And Suzanne, are you convinced that actually it's Wes Streeting, the Health Secretary, throwing his weight behind this that will make the difference this time? Or are you one of the sceptics that Michael was referring to there?
I actually do, because I spoke to Michelle Welsh, who's an MP who's been through birth trauma. She's been involved in one of the APPGs, as I have on the birth trauma.
The all-party parliamentary groups of MPs, yeah.
And I spoke to her, and I think there's nothing like a mother going through birth trauma herself to then have the year of Wes Streeting. I think it's quite, it's quite relevant, and I think that I hope that will make him definitely move things forward. Of course, there's a lot of things to achieve here. We've got a lot of families who, for years, have been traumatised, not listened to, and then moving forward to convince them that things are going to change is a big ask. But I think Baroness Amos is right. I think if you just look at the long-term damage to families, just not from it's a big topic about how much this costs the NHS, but actually the cost to families, and then the duration of the trauma that goes through families, even affecting the children who weren't involved in the birth trauma, families, marriages. This impact goes on, and people can't work. It is a huge cost to society. So it's something they've really got to get a handle on. And I think I'm hoping that Baroness Amos is going to get to grips with that next year. But as I say, it's a big task.
And Michael, when you read Baroness Amos's statement, you don't have to dig very deep to get a sense that it's been quite bruising for her, not just because she's dealing with very, very sad situations, but it sounds like lots of the families that she's talking to maybe don't think she's doing a great job.
Yes, I think that's fair to say. To be fair to her, she knows there's criticism of her and of the review, and she understands the scepticism. I spoke to her about this when I met her yesterday. There is a significant group of families who don't think this is the right approach at all. They think that there should be a statutory public inquiry, a judge-led, some would argue. And the reason for that is because they say that this review simply can't offer them accountability, and therefore nobody will be made to speak to Baroness Amos if they don't want to, and nobody be held to account. And we're not talking necessarily the midwives and the obstetricians. It's the leadership of the NHS organisations in which this harm occurred that they want held to account. They want them people to lose their jobs, and that simply hasn't happened up to now. And that is one of the reasons why a lot of people would argue that a lot of the recommendations haven't been implemented and haven't made the sustained change that was intended. There's a group of people who are supportive of it and think that it should be allowed to continue. There's a few voices that I'm aware of who were in the let's give it a chance category, who have become sceptical as it's gone on. Now, there may be, and you've always got to be careful of what you don't know, there may be people who are opposed to it who now think, actually, maybe this is worth looking at. But what I'm aware of is that some who were thinking, let's engage with this process, they have pulled back and are now thinking this may not be the way it should go. But there is a determination in government that this is the only game in town at the moment. The backstop for Mr. Streeting is that he has said he has not completely ruled out a public inquiry, but I think he wants to see what comes of this first of all and then make a decision after that.
And Suzanne, I suppose the accountability bit is the thing that you do. That's inquests and court cases and negligence for individual cases. How much of that is actually happening right now?
So it's in a lot of circumstances the only way families get accountability, and that's not okay. For me to be the only way that families can get answers, to get justice, and to get accountability for what I do. But ultimately, that's why families come to me, to get answers as to what happened, because they are, they're gaslit. They're often, mothers are blamed for the loss of their child, and that is my job to represent my clients and make sure they get access to justice, they get answers, because these are the most horrendous cases. It doesn't, the idea of losing your child to negligence but not knowing what happened, and you suspect that the care you got was below par and was not acceptable, and yet people have got to come to me to make sure they get access to justice. There needs to be much more transparency when things go wrong, because that will mean that the lessons will be learned. And at the moment, I think it really is quite obstructed.
Suzanne's completely right. The families I speak to say that the only reason they pursue legal claims is because they can't get answers by just asking the NHS Trust what happened. But the point that they make is that they don't want the money. But secondly, paying the money out has not made any difference. We pay vast amounts of money in clinical negligence payments in this country, and on the maternity clinical negligence payments in and of themselves, never mind everything else, are huge. But the point that a lot of families make is it makes no difference, because the NHS trusts that are forced to pay out, they're dealing with public money, they're not dealing with their own money. And so they just pay out this money, and in a lot of cases, things just go on. So while there is financial accountability for when things go wrong, when there's a clinical negligence case, there isn't actually behavioural accountability, and that's what they want.
The other side of this, because a lot of the reporting today is about bad care, bad attitudes in these units, but actually Baroness Amos talks about the negative attention and the effect of that on the workers, on the midwives, on the doctors, on the nurses, on everyone else in the system. Talk a bit more about some of the bad stuff that they've been going through.
So, well, some of the staff that she has spoken to have talked about receiving death threats or being attacked with rotten fruit or being attacked on social media because they work in poorly performing units. And this notion of adverse media attention, it's a double-edged sword, I should say, because on the one hand they acknowledge that it makes it harder for them to come to work and to deliver good care because they constantly feel scrutinised. On the other hand, some of them acknowledge that because they're in the media spotlight, that has proven to be the catalyst for change, and that leadership within the trust has then decided that it should focus on maternity care. So it's a double-edged sword, and when you report on these cases, it's really difficult to know where the line is, because you always have to remember that for the vast majority of women and for families, they will have a good experience. They will walk in there pregnant and they will walk out of there with a bouncing baby. And you have to remember that. The reason this is an issue is because there are too many people who aren't walking out with that in those happy circumstances. And there is a consistent belief that more could be done to ensure that more of them are walking out with a happy and healthy child.
And Suzanne, do you have sympathy for the staff, or do you sort of have to approach it as if everyone has got the potential to make a terrible mistake?
I think these are not mistakes, and that's you've got to understand this is not about people making mistakes. People professionally make mistakes. This is about care that's not of a reasonable, responsible standard, so that a midwife's giving care that no reasonable or responsible midwife would give, or obstetrician. This is not about mistakes.
Okay.
So the bar is very, very high for negligence. It's not about giving gold standard care. Midwives can give fairly poor care but not be negligent. It's about care that is so poor that no other responsible or reasonable midwife would give. So I haven't got a great deal of sympathy in some of the cases I see. Unfortunately, obviously, mine is the worst case scenario because I see the worst of what happens in maternity. But there's a lack of empathy, there's a lack of learning, and the blaming of the family is, to me, just completely unforgivable, because it destroys families and it destroys women who think that somehow they are responsible for the death of their baby or their baby's harmed as a result of it. For me to daily deal with my client living with that, I just think is unacceptable. But I get there. I see it from a different perspective.
And Suzanne, just on a sort of emotional level, what are ways people who've gone through this awful experience have come to terms with it and managed to carry on with the rest of their lives after one of the worst things that could possibly happen to them has happened to them?
Well, one of the best things of my job is that I can give them accountability. They can understand what's happened and to some degree move on. They can want change. A lot of I've got some incredible clients who are brave and campaign for better care. They campaign with charities about birth trauma and get involved in that. So that there's lots of things that can move forward, but yet they still have to, you can never, the idea that you've lost your child or any of these terrible cases, there's always that in the back of the mind. And every day I would say that the families will always remember what has happened, which is quite something to live with, I think.
And Michael, just for Wes Streeting, I mean, yet another thing he's got to grapple with, another challenge. I mean, and this is on top of last week announcing this review of the diagnosis of mental health conditions, particularly amongst young people. Then, of course, way in the background, you've got Louise Casey doing her review of adult social care. And of course, none of those are his three priorities for being health secretary, which is to get care moved out of hospitals, to get the NHS turned into a digital organisation, and to focus on prevention as much as treatment. I mean, these are all big things that are distracting from the three core missions.
Exactly, and that's why the people who support this review are saying, look, we have to give him a chance, because in broad terms, somebody said to me, there aren't many votes in sorting out maternity care. The votes are in ensuring that the NHS backlog is removed, and that people feel that they can get access to a GP far quicker than they used to before the previous election. That is probably going to be, they're probably going to be the things that Mr. Streeting and the Health Department and the wider government are going to be judged on. So the fact that he is investing so much time and effort, and he's met with dozens and dozens of families, is why people are saying you have to give this review the chance. But you are right. He's got an awful lot on his plate, and the fact that he is willing to spend so much capital on this indicates that he has described it as the thing that keeps him up at night. And so I think some of the maternity safety campaigners are saying, let's almost take advantage of that, and let's see if he can be the man that makes a difference.
Although I'm thinking back to the first conversation we had about this review a few months ago, and he did have to be sort of nudged into doing this.
Yes, I think, he's got a lot on his plate. There was a lot of pressure towards him, and the pressure was mainly at the time towards a statutory inquiry. And I think he felt he had to do something because he could see the pressure, he could feel the pressure, and he could see the data that showed it wasn't improving. The way that some people who believe this review won't work are viewing it is that this is almost a halfway house between doing nothing and the statutory inquiry that they think will be absolutely necessary at some point. So let's see what happens.
And we'll get the final review in the spring, although that, as we know in politics, is a very elastic season. Michael, thank you very much.
You're very welcome.
And Suzanne, thanks to you too.
Thank you. Thanks both.